This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. In 1870, Colonel Garnet Wolesley, already renowned as a champion of British imperialism, set out for the Red River to find out whatever Louis Riel and his Metis were doing and make them stop, or as they would have put it, enforce Canadian sovereignty in the new province of Manitoba. Along with Wolesley and his mixed British and Canadian force went 2 Toronto reporters and 1 internationally renowned burlesque queen who happened to be married to one of the reporters. Humber College's Professor Ted Glenn tells the tale at our first virtual military history night of 2021.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to RCMI Visual Military History Night. My name is Patricia Hine-White, and I am the organizer of this event. Tonight is Wednesday, January the 13th, 2021, and this presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available for viewing on RCMI YouTube channel. At this time, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to our dedicated RCMI behind-the-scenes team of RCMI President Mike Hoare, General Manager Garrett Wright, Sylvia Lau, Event Sales Manager and in-house Zoom expert, Jim Lutz, Events Committee Chair, Eric Morse, Editor of RCMI Members News, Director of Publications, member of RCMI Strategic Studies Committee, and producer of RCMI videos for their very strong support and expertise. Thank you all. Following this presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and ask you mute your mics and hold your questions till that time. Please use the raise hands function at the question period. The mute button is on the left of the screen. Click to mute and click to unmute. Our speaker, Ted Glenn, is an author and educator based at Humber College. He writes about Canadian government and history, dividing his time between Grey County and Toronto. His topic, Embedded, 1870. The incredible story of 2 journalists, a burlesque star, on the expedition to oust Louis Riel. In this presentation, our speaker, Ted Glenn, will take us all on a journey back in time to 1870 and the remarkable story of 2 reporters and 1 very, very extraordinary woman as they journey to Red River with Colonel Garnet Wolesley and his expedition force. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, a warm welcome. Over to you, Ted. I'm virtually speaking. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. Much appreciated. Let me just get myself set up here. So you said my name is Ted Glenn, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here tonight on the 150th anniversary of Colonel Garnet Wolesley's expedition to Red River. It's my privilege to present this short talk on the expedition this evening as seen through the eyes of 2 journalists, and as Pat said, 1 burlesque star who were embedded with it. My goal is to talk for about 45 minutes and then leave some time for questions afterwards. If you'd like, you're more than welcome to pose the questions in the Q&A board as I move along, and then I'll respond at the end. And so, as they say, let's get on with the show. After nearly a decade, negotiations for the sale of Rupert's land were grinding to an end in the spring of 1868. At stake were nearly 1.5 million square miles stretching from Labrador in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, to Baffin Island in the north, and the 49th parallel in the south. To prepare for the transfer, Dominion Public Works Minister William McDougall began work on plans to connect the end of the shipping lines at Lake Superior to the settlement at Red River. Senior engineer Simon Dawson recommended using an old Northwest Company canoe route linking Superior on the east by a new road to Shabandwin Lake, and on the west by a new road from Lake of the Woods to Fort Garry. MacDougall liked the plan, and he contracted Dawson to build the Eastern Road and another engineer named John Allen Snow the Western. In July 1869, Parliament ratified the Rupert's deal and set December 1st, 1869 as the closing date. Parliament also passed legislation establishing a temporary government for the Northwest Territories. For all his work on the file, Prime Minister MacDonald named William MacDougall the new governor. Ottawa's plans weren't well received in Red River. In August, news of MacDougall's appointment as governor reached the settlement just as Dominion survey crews were arriving. Local residents, about 5,700 French-speaking Métis, about 4,100 English-speaking Métis, and most of the 1,600 white settlers felt betrayed. They'd neither been consulted on the sale of their land nor involved in choosing their governor. And so in October, the agitation came to a head. Longtime resident Andre Noel found a survey crew at work on his hay privilege, and he rushed to find his bilingual cousin, Louis Riel, to help him figure out what was going on. Riel turned with 18 mounted Métis. He stood famously on the survey chain and told the crew, the territory south of the Assiniboine River belongs to the people of Red River, not to Canada. The Métis would not allow the survey to proceed any further. Meanwhile, MacDougall was on his way from Ottawa to take up his new duties in Red River. On October 31st, he reached the border of Pembina, where he was met by a courier with a message from Riel. Sir, the National Committee of the Métis of Red River orders you not to enter the territory of the Northwest without special permission of the above-mentioned committee. MacDougall was enraged. He tore a strip off the messenger, and he pushed his way into the territory, straight up against Ambroise Didier Lepine, Riel's military lieutenant and chief enforcer, and his posse had been ordered to intercept MacDougall and escort him out of the settlement. On his way out, Lepine told MacDougall, "You must not return beyond this line." MacDougall, without military or even a security detail, had no choice but to leave. While MacDougall cooled his heels at Pembina, 100 armed Métis stormed Fort Garry and took control of the Hudson's Bay's food and munitions stored there. In a show of loyalty to MacDougall and the Dominion government, local businessman and agitator John Schultz organized a group of 45 men and women at his store. On December 7th, Riel responded to the threat. At 2 a.m, 200 armed troops moved on Schultz's house and trained 2 cannon on the main door. The Loyalists surrendered immediately and were marched under guard to imprisonment at Fort Garry. The rebellion at Red River spooked the Dominion government. Prime Minister MacDonald tried to buy time to prepare to send a military force to Red River in the spring. First, he got London to postpone the transfer of Rupert's land until peaceable possession could be guaranteed. And then he sent emissaries to Red River to assure the locals that the rights wouldn't be affected. Then his government got to work on the expedition itself. Simon Dawson was ordered to complete construction of the road from Thunder Bay to Chevandoin Lake. 2 steamers, the Algoma and the Chickara, were contracted to ferry men and material from Collingwood to Fort William on Thunder Bay. Shipyards in Ontario and Quebec were contracted to build 140 boats to convey troops across the old Northwest route to Red River. Robert Pither and Wemyss Simpson were sent ahead to secure permission for the expedition to travel across the traditional Anishinaabe lands. And Great Britain was persuaded to participate in the mission, MacDonald arguing these insurgents would more readily lay down their arms to a British force than one entirely Canadian. In January, Riel convened the Convention of 40 to draw up the terms for negotiating union with Canada. By early February, these were completed, and delegates were chosen to send to Ottawa. Riel also agreed to release the remaining prisoners taken at Schultz's store back in December. Unfortunately, news of the prisoners' release was slow to get out. On February 12th, 60 armed men left Portage-la-Prairie for Fort Garry behind Major Charles Bolton with plans to spring the prisoners. When Riel heard they'd reached Kildonan, he was furious. He sent a message telling them to disperse, as all the prisoners had already been released. Bolton's crew agreed, but chose to make a point of marching home directly beside the Métis headquarters at Fort Garry. As expected, a troop of guardsmen rode out and took Bolton and his men prisoner on February 17th. Among Bolton's men was a hot-headed Irishman and member of the Orange Lodge named Thomas Scott. Witnesses said Scott attacked his guards, taunted them with racial slurs, and threatened to kill Riel. To shut him up, 2 guards dragged Scott from his cell and beat him senseless. And still, despite more warnings and a personal entreaty from Riel for peace, Scott wouldn't shut up. Riel had him placed in irons on March the 1st, and on the 3rd, brought him before a military tribunal headed by Lepine and including Andre Noll and Elsie Goulet. Scott was charged with taking up arms against the provisional government and striking his guards. The tribunal issued a death penalty. Next day, Noll and Goulet retrieved Scott from his cell. He was led through the main gate to a firing squad waiting outside the fort. Scott's body was never found. The execution of Thomas Scott ignited a firestorm of rage and indignation across Protestant Ontario. Tens of indignation meetings sprang up where action was demanded from the government. The largest meeting was actually held in Toronto on April the 6th, where 10,000 people packed the square in front of Old City Hall and demanded Riel and his French Catholic government be put down. After that, plans for the expedition fell quickly into place. Many hoped it would deliver the vengeance they were seeking. Colonel Garnet Wolesley, an up-and-coming British officer who'd been stationed in Canada for the past few years, was named head of the expedition. Canada agreed to contribute 705 soldiers, raised in 2 battalions from militia units across Ontario and Quebec. These began arriving in Toronto on May the 2nd for inspection and training. And Britain confirmed it would send 19 soldiers from the Royal Artillery, 19 Royal Engineers, and 352 infantry from the 1st Battalion 60th Rifles. While Wolesley waited for the ice to clear from the Great Lakes, negotiations with the Red River delegates finished in early May with an agreement to create Canada's 5th province, Manitoba. The steamer Algoma was readying to depart from the tiny port of Collingwood on the southern shores of Georgian Bay as the Manitoba Act was introduced into the House of Commons on May 2nd. By this point, Garnet Wolesley's expedition to Red River was already story of the year, and Canadian newspaper publishers were jockeying to sell it. The most enterprising were George Brown of the Globe and John Ross Robertson of the Daily Telegraph, both from Toronto. In April 1870, the 2 arranged to have their reporters accompany Wolesley all the way from Toronto to Fort Garry. Molyneux St. John was the Globe's special correspondent. He'd been a Royal Marine who'd seen action in China in the Battle of Canton in 1857 and in the Pig War against the Americans in 1859. Go and look that one up for you history buffs out there. He'd been on the Globe's editorial board since emigrating to Canada in 1868. St. John got the assignment because John Ross Robertson had just stole Robert Cunningham away from the Globe. Cunningham was actually the Globe's first reporter on the Northwest Beat. Back in December 1869, he had actually traveled out to Red River to interview Riel. He got the interview, but then he was thrown in jail. He was expelled from the settlement and warned by Riel never to return. But return he did, as our commissioner for the Daily Telegraph. St. John and Cunningham weren't the only 2 civilians embedded with Wolesley's expedition. All right, so on May 3rd, Cunningham, St. John, and Rano took the Great Northern Railway from Toronto to Collingwood, where they found the tiny port in a whirlwind of activity. Trains had been running nonstop from Toronto for the previous 4 days, and expedition cargo spilled along the shore of a narrow wharf jutting into the bay. Moored to the wharf were Dawson's 2 steamers, the Algoma and the Chickara. The men there were just focused on loading the Algoma with all the non-military equipment Dawson needed to complete his road to Shebandwin Lake. Wagons, horses, oxen, hay, fodder, and all manner of construction equipment such as wheelbarrows, spades, picks, and axes. Expedition officials had a hunch the US government would not allow military vessels to pass through its canal at Sault Ste. Marie as part of an ongoing dispute with Great Britain. Officials thought if Dawson and his crew could make it through the canal, they at least could get the road to Shebandwin finished before the troops arrived. And hopefully, that would buy the diplomats in Ottawa, London, and Washington enough time to resolve their dispute and allow the Chickara and the first load of military material to travel through the canal. The hunch paid off. Early on May 5th, the Algoma steamed peacefully through the Soo Canal and made way for Fort William unmolested. Anticipating a different sort of welcome for the Chikara and its load of military materiel, Cunningham elected to stay on at the Soo, while St. John and Rano traveled on to Thunder Bay. The Algoma sighted out Louis Riel late Saturday afternoon and landed at the tiny village of Government Station, 5 miles east of Fort William, in the middle of the night. The waters there were too shallow for the Algoma to tie up directly to the small wharf, so she anchored 300 yards offshore, and a tow line was run along, which a flat-bottomed scow was soon carrying freight. When the work was completed early Monday, the captain raised anchor, set course back to the Soo, and Dawson's men marched up the road to get on with their work. All thought the Algoma would return in the next few days, and that perhaps the diplomats would resolve the crisis and the Chikara would arrive as well. But it wouldn't be until May 26th that Thunder Bay would be connected to the outside world again. Until then, St. John, Rano, and Dawson's crew would live as a party of isolated backwoodsmen, as St. John called them. When St. John and Rano arrived, Government Station was a small but pretty little village. At the center was a British ensign flapping in the breeze, with 10 or so wooden houses scattered around. One served as government headquarters, another 4 were stores of different varieties, and another 4 or 5 were private houses. To the west were the tents of Dawson's camp. With nothing else to do, St. John joined senior engineer Lindsay Russell to see firsthand the state of Dawson's famous road. They set off in a 4-wheel buggy on the morning of Wednesday, May 11th. St. John said the first section of the road to Kaministaqua Bridge at mile 21 was the most developed. The next 20 miles to Strawberry Creek was a succession of level stretches and easy gradations of ascent and descent. In some places, Dawson's men had removed groves of trees and blasted stumps, and in other low-lying areas, they had built fascine or a corduroy of logs covered with earth. West from Strawberry Creek at mile 20, the road wound down a long winding hill into the Kaministaqua Valley and across a bridge over which heavy wagons and artillery could pass. From the Kaministaqua Bridge to the Mattawan Bridge at mile 26, the road went over a large red marl hill, and at Sunshine Creek, the road crossed a temporary bridge and entered the woods for 11 miles where it strikes the Oscandaga at mile 39. Parts of this section were good, some of them as yet to be finished. St. John said most of the ground, in fact, was covered in moss. In fact, it is in a state of nature. The Oscandaga River was as far as the road reached on May 11th. On May 16, news reached Government Station of a massive fire raging through the woods. St. John left with Russell the next day to inspect the damage. They got as far as 6 Mile Creek, where the roar of a fire became audible, and vast columns of black smoke rose leeward of the bridge. A gale-force wind had picked up from the west, driving hawks and other birds before it. Very quickly, the road was blocked with thick black smoke. It took them over an hour to pick their way back down to Government Station, where they found all the men turned out and a line of points drawn at which the fight with the fire was to be made. The horses had been removed from their stables and picketed as far from danger as possible. The men drew water from the bay by the cask. Depots were filled all along the boundary of the woods, and buildings, particularly the stables and the houses, were drenched as the raging fire hemmed them in on 3 sides. Every exertion, St. John said, would now be necessary to save home and property, if not life itself. Just after 1 o'clock, the fire burst through the edge of the forest and spread along the partially cleared land of the settlement, seizing upon every trunk, shrub, log, and stump along the line clearing. Where there was grass or undergrowth, the flames were able to lick right to the water's edge. The men were too late saving one woman's small house. The flames attacked the ground logs, sprung upon the roof, and raced around the edges. Water seemed only to heighten its fury, and in a few minutes, the poor woman's home was a smoldering ruin. At some point, the wind shifted, and long tongues of flame reached for the center of the village, testing the worth and endurance of each man to the utmost. For 3 hours, the men fought through blinding and choking smoke. As soon as they were successful in one spot, the fire would spring up in another as if by invisible hands. Cordwood stacked on the wharf caught fire, and sparks from it set ablaze everything that was made of wood around the central buildings. It was here that the men made a last stand, marshalling the greatest exertions necessary to save the houses themselves. They went into the black smoke to cast water on the fire, little knowing whether they could come out of it again, and others threw themselves on the ground to get a breath of air. Russell ordered all the gunpowder be thrown in the bay alongside all the tool chests and personal effects that had already been dumped there. Eventually, with the wind's help, the fire was at last got under. The exhausted crew watched it roar off down the bay. A couple days later, St. John rode back up the road to assess the damage. He said the fire had consumed the greater part of the country between the bay and Shibandwin Lake, between 40 and 50 miles. All the smaller bridges along the road, even many of the earth-covered culverts and corduroy sections had been destroyed. Meanwhile, in Washington, diplomats were successful in hammering out a deal that would allow military vessels through the Soo Canal. The Canadian government immediately chartered 6 more steamers, 4 schooners, 2 gunboats, 2 tugs, and a flotilla of barges, rafts, and scows to get the expedition back on track. It would be all decks on hand to transport the expedition's 1,100 troops, 700 voyageurs, guides, scouts, teamsters, and laborers, and thousands of tons of munitions and supplies to Thunder Bay. All told, the fleet would make 19 trips between May 25th and June 26th, when the last of the expedition's supplies were brought up. The Chickara with Wolesley aboard was the first to reach Government Station on May 25. The first thing Wolesley did was rechristen Government Station Prince Arthur's Landing. Then, he and Lindsay Russell rode up to the Oskandage to get a handle on the state of Dawson's Road. What he found was pretty much as St. John had described 2 weeks earlier. The first four miles from the Oskandage were still under construction. More than half the next section was only cut through the woods, and the last 5 miles to Shibandwin Lake haven't even been marked out through the woods. Wolesley was in a bind. He had orders to leave Fort Garry with the British contingent no later than August 20th, in order to ship back to Britain by Christmas. The imbroglio at the Soo put that timeline in jeopardy. And now delays on Dawson's Road meant the expedition might not even reach Red River by fall. And an early freeze-up could mean British troops wouldn't get home until spring. The pressure on Wolesley could literally be seen building along the shores of Thunder Bay. Between May 26th and June 3rd, 8 vessels disgorged 700 troops, scores of voyageurs and teamsters, tons of stores, supplies and materiel, and dozens of horses and oxen. On June 3rd, Wolesley came up with the idea to help relieve the pressure. He proposed sending 8 boats up the Kaministiquia River to see if it was feasible to bypass the road entirely and reach the bridge at mile 21 by water. Captain Young and Lieutenant Fraser were put in charge of a small team to oversee that project. Simon Dawson opposed the experiment as a reckless danger to both the men and the boats. While Young and Fraser labored to move their boats up the Kaministiquia River, particularly around the daunting Kakabeka Falls, Dawson's transportation service began moving supplies to the base camp at the Mattawan Bridge at mile 26. Progress was slow, as alarming numbers of the horses were falling ill. On June 9, St. John said 20 of the 50 horses available were out of commission, with many more rapidly approaching the same state. On top of this were 3 days of heavy rains that made the road beyond the Kaministiquia Bridge impassable to the wagons. Lindsay Russell told St. John that the combined effect of the fire, the rain, and the horses likely meant no part of the expedition would leave Fort Garry this winter. The only good news in all of this was that Young and Fraser had been able to get their boats to the smooth water beyond Kakabeka Falls. Wolesley deemed the experiment a success and ordered a second detachment of boats under Captain Northey to depart up the Kaministiquia River the next day. On June 10, Wolesley ordered Young and Fraser to see how far they could float their boats up the Mattawan River beyond the Kaministiquia Bridge. About this time, Cunningham described how the tiny outpost of Government Station had mushroomed from a motley collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents into the bustling Prince Arthur's Landing. Cunningham said the mix of wooden houses, stores, and canvas tents had become very gay and pretty, and many tents sporting green curtains and rustic tables to facilitate the toiletries and the meal. A number of troops had built poplar fences around their tents and strung up a very numerous assortment of flags. One of these sported a red ensign surrounded by a frying pan, a symbol meant to designate the locality of the regimental kitchen. St. John said the streets were marked off between the tents. Control Road was flanked by control department buildings. Bakery Lane led to the field ovens. Ordnance Road was home to the Royal Artillery and the Royal Engineers. And Shoefly Avenue boasted the principal comic vocalist of the upper camp. Shoefly, of course, referred to Shoefly Don't Bother Me, the popular burlesque ditty just about everyone was whistling and dancing to in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Not all the soldiers' time was spent working on Dawson's Road. On June 23rd, a much anticipated boat race took place between the Ontario Battalion's No. 5 Company and the Royal Engineers. The Ontario crew had recently defeated No. 7 Company for the honor of being the first volunteers to square off against the British regulars. And so, at precisely 7:30, Wolesley fired his pistol to begin the race. The Royal Engineers got off to a strong start, but with a series of splendid spurts and gallant oaring, the No. 5 Company crew kept even to about the 1 mile mark. At that point, the steady stroke of the Ontario men told, and the No. 5 Company boat pulled steadily ahead over the last half mile to a distance of more than 2 lengths by the finish line. The judge, Lieutenant Colonel John McNeil, declared the winning time at 8 minutes, 47 seconds. Not bad for a bunch of volunteers in a heavy and unwieldy military boat, I guess. The gaggle of spectators cheered the crews as they returned to the starting area, and Wolesley complimented each of the Royal Engineers as they stepped ashore. Cunningham identified the last of these as Jack the Major Maloney. Cunningham said the Major was quite a character, having done more to give vivacity and good temper to the camp than any other man. His native wit is something prodigious. His sallies are oftentimes irresistible. You just require to look at him to see the kind of man he is. For great round massive smiles are settled on every feature. Once the crews were welcomed back on shore, Cunningham said the Major mounted an ad hoc rostrum and addressed the troops after shaking hands with Wolesley. Fellow patriots, Maloney began, you ought to be very proud of the crew of No. 5 boat this night. Why, Major? Someone asked. Now, don't be in such a hurry, Maloney said. Wasn't I just coming to tell you all about it? But I can assure the owner of that voice, I said why, that judging from the voice itself, and judging from the face, and judging from his part in history, and judging from his inevitable future history, that it will be a very long time indeed before any gentleman in such a public and gallant assembly as this will have the hardihood to rise and tell such a thundering lie as to say that anybody will ever and can ever be proud of him. Everyone laughed. The Major smiled. Yes, gentlemen, I say, and I will say it 1,000 times if you please, even though I am one of the victims, that you should be proud of us for licking the engineers. That's so, Major, said a young private. Brethren, the child's name is Johnny, Maloney exclaimed. The private collapsed in laughter. And now, gentlemen, I have nearly done, and all that I have to say further is that the crew of No. 5 Company are ready now, ready to row with any 7 men in the brigade. So you'd better go to bed like good boys, say your prayers, always take care in every circumstance in which you may be placed. You behave yourselves like gentlemen, so you may do the honor your queen, your country, and your mothers. After 3 cheers for the Queen, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Peters Jarvis, the Royal Engineers, No. 5 crew, the Major gave up the rostrum and vanished into the crowd. Ahem. There was no Major Maloney on the expedition, not even a Maloney. I submit that Cunningham's Major was one of the many ruses both he and St. John used when writing about Rana. But you have to read more about that in the book. The expedition was set to launch from Shubandhuan at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, July the 16th. As the hour approached, though, Cunningham said preparations were still incomplete, as many of the boats still required repairs from the dings and knocks endured on the rapids and portages up from the bay. St. John said hijinks didn't help matters. One soldier tried to appropriate the gear from another. Someone else complained that his boat had fewer barrels of pork or flour than others, and then the inevitable fight broke out concerning which belonged to whom or who had more or less than the other. The pressure to launch increased as morning bled into afternoon. The control officers marched around with memorandum books in their hands, and the regimental officers barked for Sergeant this or Corporal that. At several times, it seemed the boats were ready to go, and then some complication or other arose. And then late in the afternoon, Wolesley arrived. He made it clear that he expected the detachments to start that night, regardless. So then finally, at 8:30, the first boat shoved off from the little wharf at the southeast end of Shubandhuan Lake. St. John said it was a beautiful evening. The winds had died down. The lake was calm like a mill pond. The sun had just set in a cloudless sky, leaving the western border of the lake painted with a mellowed tinge of purples and reds. The stillness was broken by shouts of encouragement and goodbyes from the well-wishers on shore. "No more rapids," exclaimed one. "No more poling," cried another. "Off we go to Red River," repeated many. St. John said everyone was in great spirits with the long, dragging, wearisome journey from Thunder Bay now behind them. As soon as the first brigade got under way, the second followed suit with the Royal Artillery and the Royal Engineers. But it would take another 17 days before the last of the expedition left Shibandouin. Around this time, St. John wrote in one of his articles about a temporary inability to hold a pen in any way other than that in which one holds a spoon. On August 3rd, he said, owing to a disabled hand, I had been unable to write. On August 21st, he confessed that his crippled arm and the remnants of a lengthened attack of fever and ague had forced him to dictate his stories from his bed. And then, on August 24th, St. John revealed that Kate Rano was the one taking his dictation. My crippled arm prevents me from writing. Though my wife sits patiently writing from my dictations, the joint effort is to us at least hardly satisfactory. It is no easy matter to arrange and dictate the mass of interesting and uninteresting events that pass before one when sickness comes to impede one's efforts. In other words, at least from the time when they departed Shibandouin Lake on July 16, the Globe's coverage of the Red River expedition was jointly produced by Kate Rano and Mullen of St. John. I'm going to flash forward here to Tuesday, August the 23rd. In just over 5 weeks, the expedition had traveled 600 miles from Thunder Bay through unspoiled wilderness and completed 47 portages, totaling a distance of just over 7 miles. And in Wolesley's words, it was a feat unparalleled in our military annals. We have descended a great river, esteemed so dangerous from its rapids, falls, and whirlpools that none but experienced voyageurs attempt its navigation. On the evening of August 23rd, the expedition pitched camp one last time, 7 miles short of Fort Garry. Around midnight, Cunningham said, a drenching storm of rain and thunder came on and saturated everything most effectually. It was by far the most severe storm they'd encountered since Thunder Bay, he thought. Throughout the night, lightning flashed brilliantly, thunder shook the muddy ground like an earthquake, and rain fell torrent upon torrent. The storm was relentless. At 4 a.m., the bugle sounded to start the final day, but the rain was still relentless. Wolesley pushed departure off till 7 o'clock. Luckily, the rain let up for a brief few moments, then allowing the troops to gulp a quick breakfast and pack up camp. Then the boats were loaded one last time. The rain began pounding as the force pulled upstream. St. John said everyone was in a state of mystery as to what to expect at Fort Garry. All were confident of entering as conquerors, but ignorant as to whether they were to fight or take possession peaceably. At 8:30, Wolesley ordered the boats ashore 2 miles north of Fort Garry at Point Douglas. The troops assembled there in battle formation, Captain Wallace's advance guard looming ahead in the mist. Next came Wolesley and his staff, dripping from every seam of their waterproof coats, and mounted on what horses Wallace was able to scrounge up. Next was the main body of the battalion and the engineers and artillery with 2 carts limbering cannon. Captain Northey brought up the rear with a small guard. To the right of the formation, a number of horsemen having some indirect connection with the expedition had gathered, and scattered all around were a number of other hangers-on, including the Hudson Bay men, clothed in their standard issue, blue-clothed, brass-buttoned capotes. When Wolesley signaled ready, McNeil galloped off to close the skirmishers, and the main body marched forward in fours from open column. With all the rain, the road was near impassable. Thick black mud, ankle deep at every step, St. John said. About 600 yards north of the fort, a few dozen spectators and followers had gathered, waiting to offer their encouragement and guesstimates about where Louis Riel was and what he was doing. Wolesley ordered the battalion into open column there, with the high hope that Riel would fight. All could see the north gate of the fort was shut. A large gun was mounted en barbette over it, and not a sign of a man could be seen. The soldiers marched bravely toward the fort, encouraging one another with cheers of, "He's going to fight." A couple hundred yards off, Wolesley ordered halt and sent officers McNeil, Butler, and Dennison forward to put eyes directly on the fort. They galloped off around the perimeter, and everyone held their breath. But Dennison returned just as quickly with news that the south gate was wide open and there was no sign of activity within. Wolesley ordered the Wallace's skirmishers to establish a perimeter around the fort and not let anyone in or out. When the perimeter was set, Dennison, Butler, and McNeil rode back around the south gate. The rest of the force followed along. St. John said the soldiers cast glances up and down as if to seek the best spots for storming. But there would be no fight today. The soldiers rounded the last bastion, and the band struck up a quick step as they passed through the south gate and formed into companies on the made quadrangle. Once assembled, the officers hoisted the Union Jack up the flagstaff, while the band played God Save the Queen. The ceremony ended with a 21-gun salute. Of course, the question on everyone's minds was, where's Riel? Wolesley ordered Fort Garry searched for men and guns. St. John said it was in a dreadful state of mud and dirt. In the main dining room, they found the undeclared remnants of Riel's breakfast on the table. Next door, in a room used for a study, a variety of papers were found littering the table, Canadian statutes, encyclopedias, and other books, together with printed proclamations of Riel's. Within a couple hours, the Royal Artillery finished taking stock of the guns and munitions found inside Fort Garry. 40 sidearms, 47 muskets, and 20 cannon of various sizes, ranging from 9 to 1-pounders. All the guns were loaded, some to the muzzle. In addition, 300,000 rounds of ammunition and over 100 barrels of powder were discovered. Cunningham thought if Riel had had the courage and system to use it, he could have blown the whole 60th into the water. There was no sign of Riel or any of his lieutenants. Writing later in the day, St. John reported on reliable authority that Riel and his men had crossed the bridge over the Assiniboine just as the expedition was passing between the town and the fort. They said Riel watched the Union Jack being hoisted from Bishop Hachet's front porch and the firing of the salute and remained there for the remainder of the day and the next. The search for Riel and his men ended on the afternoon of August 24th. At that point, Eileen and his artillerymen hauled 2 of the captured brass 6-pounders outside the walls, fired a second royal salute, and gave 3 cheers for the Queen and 3 for Wolesley. And so ended the taking of Fort Garry. Cunningham described the next 3 weeks in Red River as a reign of terror. By September 2nd, he said he no longer felt safe. Stores and houses were being broken into, goods stolen. Drunken revelers were firing off their revolvers at midday in the open streets. Part of the problem was that Wolesley's authority didn't extend beyond the expedition. Until the new Lieutenant Governor Adams Archibald arrived, Wolesley was forced to ask Donald Smith to assume temporary civic powers under the old Hudson's Bay laws. But given recent troubles, no one wanted to serve as a magistrate or a lawman. As fast as Smith swore in special constables, Cunningham said they resigned as fast as they were called upon to act, out of a fear of Riel and his friends. Once Archibald arrived on September the 3rd, another problem presented itself. Wolesley's timetable for having the British troops depart. St. John said the imminent withdrawal of the British troops stoked a great fear in the locals, as both English and French speakers believed the Brits embodied the Queen's authority and could be trusted as they were without any partisan feeling in local matters. The same couldn't be said of the Canadian soldiers. While the volunteers might very well turn out to be well-disciplined soldiers and excellent men, St. John believed very little provocation would be needed to draw the Canadian volunteers in, which might end only in bloodshed. The only British soldiers in Red River after September 2nd were Wolesley and 5 headquarters officers. One of the defining events of the Reign of Terror was the murder of Elsie Goulet on September the 12th. Cunningham met Goulet that morning, where Goulet offered to take Cunningham to meet Riel. Cunningham had to postpone as he had other business that day, but assured a visibly nervous Goulet he should not have any fear of going into Winnipeg to get on with his business. The two planned to meet up later in the day to discuss meeting Riel. Assured by Cunningham, Goulet crossed the river into Winnipeg. But near one of the taverns, he was accosted by someone who asked if he were not the person who tied the blind on Thomas Scott. Others heard, and Goulet ran back toward the river, fearing his life. 2 men from the Ontario Battalion and a third, a voyageur from the expedition, saw Goulet and gave chase. When they got to the river, Goulet jumped in and started swimming across. The 2 soldiers and the voyageur pelted Goulet with rocks and sticks. One hit Goulet in the head, and he sank immediately. Goulet's lifeless body was retrieved by friends and family later that day. Elsie Goulet's murder heightened fears of another insurrection and sparked the new lieutenant governor to action. On the 16th, Archibald appointed Manitoba's first executive council, and then a couple days later established the province's first police force. On the 26th, he sent a company of soldiers south to Pembina on rumors that armed Metis were gathering along the border to avenge Goulet's death. Nothing, though, came of the rumors. By the end of September, both St. John and Cunningham were reporting that Manitoba had become as quiet and dull as it was before. And so, with the work of reporting on the expedition having come to an end, Cunningham, St. John, and Reynolds moved on to the next stages of their lives. Covering the Red River expedition changed Robert Cunningham's life, especially his connection to Elsie Goulet. In the fall of 1870, Cunningham became co-publisher of the Manitoban, a newspaper he used to support Archibald's administration and advocate for conciliation in his newly adopted home. Cunningham's efforts eventually led him to run for Parliament in 1872, where he became a vocal advocate for fair treatment of Indigenous peoples in Manitoba and the Northwest. Cunningham earned the praise and respect of the Métis community, even Louis Riel himself. The Métis leader came out of hiding to serve as a returning officer for Cunningham in 1873. Unfortunately, Cunningham's life was cut short in the fall of 1874. He died unexpectedly while returning to Manitoba to take up new duties on the Council of the Northwest Territories. Adams Archibald also relied on Molyneux St. John to help with his conciliation policy. Appointed first clerk of the Manitoba legislature, St. John was signatory as well to treaties 1, 2, and 3. He continued in this line of work, serving briefly as superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1878. Then, over the next 15 years, St. John churned through various appointments and contracts, ultimately dying in office as Gentleman Usher of the Black Rod in the Parliament of Canada. In the fall of 1870, Kate Reynolds returned to Montreal in her career on the stage. In the spring of 1871, she took a short break and toured a handful of Eastern Canadian cities with her public lecture, The Great Northwest. According to reviews, no copy of the lecture actually exists. Reynolds regaled audiences with tales of her efforts to join St. John on the trip and the difficulties she encountered overcoming the objections raised against her accompanying the expedition. She recalled her trips on the Kaministiquia and from the Shibanaman to the Winnipeg, and relating graphic detail the picturesque scenery of the route. Reynolds also recounted the enthusiasm and readiness of the volunteers to undertake the difficult expedition and the many difficulties overcome by the troops. She described the final approach to Fort Garry and testified to the order and tranquility which had rapidly succeeded to the period of disorder and passion. Reynolds concluded The Great Northwest by demanding justice be done to the Indian, and that in the future there may be no cause for reproach of conscience, and that when what is now a prairie and a wilderness becomes the garden and the wheat field, the flowers will bloom over no grave of oppression, nor hamlet be built upon land wrenched from the Indian, but the dominion will grow based on justice and truth, and prosperity will flourish over the land. One reviewer said this generous appeal on behalf of the Indian tribes, for whom no settlement had yet been made, was met with continued applause. Reynolds died in a traffic accident in Montreal in 1893. She is buried next to her husband in Montreal's Mount Royal Cemetery. Robert Cunningham, Molyneux St. John, and Kate Reynolds were early pioneers of embedded journalism. They canoed over the same rapids, traversed the same portages, ate the same pork tack, and were bitten by the same sandflies and mosquitoes, faced the same diplomatic and military threats, and experienced firsthand the repercussions of military action on a local population. But while these challenges provided great content for coverage of the expedition, the experience did something more. It embedded these three directly and significantly into the lifeblood of their adopted country. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Now is your time.
Well, we've got a hand up. Dorinda Fenton, I believe you've got a a hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Glenn. I found that really interesting, and I have read your book, Embedded. I'm wondering, are you working on anything else historical at the moment?
I am. I'm taking a bit of a turn from military history. I'm working on an account, a history of the Canada's Sixth Ministry under Prime Minister Mackenzie Bowell.
Okay, so we have to watch this space.
How's that? That work?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. Who did Garnet Wolesley report to? Did he report back to England, or did he report to the Canadian government, or did he report to somebody else in the chain of command? In other words, who was responsible for sort of the overall operation of the advance from Thunder Bay, and Port Arthur, and so on, to Winnipeg or to Manitoba?
No, he unfortunately the gentleman's name is slipping my mind. John something. Sorry, I forgot. If you email me afterwards, I'll get you the details. He was appointed by Great Britain to head up the military operation on the ground. So Wolesley reported to him, and then he reported back to Great Britain.
Okay, but nobody was reporting to the Canadian government at all, really.
Not directly, no.
That's interesting. Thank you.
James Higginson Rollins asked, how long did it take for news articles about the expedition to get to Toronto, Montreal? Well, at some parts of the journey, quite fast. I mean, there was a telegraph link in Collingwood, so things that were happening in Collingwood or on the steamers in Thunder Bay, those pieces were getting back to Toronto, Montreal within a day or two, usually, just because the steamers were going back and forth. When they got out on the route, though, it would take up to 10 days, 2 weeks for some of the pieces to get back. And those were brought back by mail bag, largely, back through the chain of the expedition all the way back to Thunder Bay and then onto the steamers again. So it depends where they were, but it could be up to a couple of weeks. Robert Roy asked, Riel went south, but it sounds like if only communication had been better, perhaps some difficulties then and later might have been avoided. Care to elaborate? Yeah, that's for sure. One of the things that's really interesting about the approach is that Wolesley had actually sent forward an intelligence officer from Thunder Bay to go and talk to Riel about his intentions, and Riel basically assured him, he said, look, my intentions are peaceable. We've got the Manitoba Act, and I'm more than happy, ready, and willing to hand over power when Wolesley gets here. So he reported back at Fort Frances, and even despite all of that, I mean, Wolesley came in hot. He didn't come in as a peaceable mission. So that is one piece of communication that I think probably could have been acted on a little better. There were others as well, but that's a pretty significant one. Sophie Eisberg Marshall asked, thank you so much for this. It was super interesting. I was wondering what first drew your interest to this topic. Well, I found a short appendix to George Taylor's Toil and Trouble, which is an account of the various Red River expeditions. There was a very short little appendix that talked about a woman going to Red River with the expedition. And it completely intrigued me. If you read Simon Dawson's official account of the expedition, he says right at the beginning, look, some of the river wasn't too difficult. In fact, there's one fat newspaper editor, Robert Cunningham, and then an English gentleman and his wife did it in a canoe by themselves, and they didn't have any problem. So there was this rumor that a woman had actually accompanied the expedition for years and years and years, and so it caught my attention. I thought, well, there might be a bit more of a story here. So that's what caught me. If you want to have a look on the Dundurn Press blog, actually, I've written a little bit more about how that story came up for me. An anonymous individual asked what was happening between Canada and the US that the military boats could not pass through the locks. Well, it was actually what was happening between the US and Great Britain. Great Britain was still ticked, or the US was still ticked at Great Britain for the trade embargoes during the Civil War, and we're still trying to come to some kind of a settlement on that. That was number one. Number two, the annexationists in the States were very strong. They had, the U.S. had recently purchased Alaska. They were looking at Rupert's land, which was, at the most 100,000 people scattered across the plains, and we're thinking that, if they annexed Rupert's land, they, complete America's manifest destiny. So they thought, well, if we just slow down the expedition some, maybe we got a chance of going in and taking it for ourselves. And that became one of the most important reasons why MacDonald wanted to have the British on side for the expeditions. They wanted to be able to lay claim to jurisdiction with an army on the ground. 300 rounds of ammo in Fort Garry. Why and who put it there? Well, most of that ammunition was Hudson's Bay store that had been there, and other stuff that the Métis had collected since assuming the fort, taking over the fort in December. But they were ready. They didn't act on it, but they were certainly ready. A question from, sorry, who exactly this is from. Thank you for a very interesting account. Have journalists changed much in their recounting of facts, do you think? I don't know. I think an interesting study might be to kind of look at the history of embedded journalism and see how it's definitely changed over the years. I mean, Wolesley was quite clear in some of his earlier memoirs that he saw the only role for journalists being along in any military campaign was basically for communications for the army, putting out their messages. He saw no role for journalists in the field, and so he thought he was using them by having them along. So yeah, I think that would be a really interesting study to see how that's changed and how embedded journalists have seen their role changed over time. Now the question, was there any disciplinary action against the soldiers involved in the murder at Red River? Well, yes and no. I mean, Peters, who was in charge of the militia at Fort Garry, came down hard on them, on the men in general. He confined them to barracks. He had them on very strict kind of discipline over the next few weeks. But from the military side, no, they didn't actually do anything. They were able to, the new government actually appointed a couple of magistrates to look into the murder, and they conducted about 10 days worth of hearings. They listened to some witnesses, but at the end of the day, nobody named a name. Everybody, St. John said, everybody knew who it was. Everybody knew who the two militiamen were, knew who the voyageur was, but nobody would name a name in the courts. And so they ended up not being able to convict anybody. So no, they got away with it. James Higginson Rollins asked, did the journalists pay their own way or did the army? Did the military make use of the journalists in their reporting? The journalists paid their own way. And I don't know, I guess in a sense the military, Wolesley in particular, did use the military because he was trying to kind of generate public support for the initiative. I realize, Sophie asks again, I realize this might be a silly question, but what is embedded journalism? Embedded journalism is basically where you take, where journalists are embedded, they're placed with a military unit as it goes through a campaign. It became a very popular term, it became very popularized during the Iraq War, where the US government took a bunch of journalists along with them and for an agreement that they would present kind of a certain side of the story, they were allowed to kind of sit up front and watch the war as it went on. So this is, I would argue, is the first example of embedded journalism in Canada, and probably one of the earliest examples of embedded journalism. There was a bit in the Civil War, but this is definitely one of the earliest examples of it. We have two hands raised. We have David McCarthy and Fraser McKee.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
He's back on mute again.
How's that?
That's good.
There we go.
I was just going to ask the question, did Wolesley exhibit or do any censorship of the reports being sent back by the journalists to Toronto?
My sense is that he didn't. For a lot of it, and for the reason why I think that, I don't have any proof, but there's a lot of the times that the reporters were writing and sending stuff back where they were, tens of miles away from Wolesley. Wolesley didn't have control over over what they were, because he just simply wasn't there. Like when they left Thunder Bay and they went to Fort Garry, the expedition itself stretched over 160 miles. Wolesley was at the front. The journalists were near the front, but they spent a lot of time, a month or so, distant from him. When they were back in Thunder Bay, it was just there were too many steamers going back and forth for them to put a check on what was going on. And frankly, I don't think Wolesley cared.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Fraser McKee.
You were talking a few minutes ago about the problems with the Americans and passing armored ships, or at least armaments, up through. Weren't they governed by the Rush-Bagot Agreement after the War of 1812? In other words, that was still in effect at the time of the Second War. We were still having to reach special arrangements that we got to have armed ships built in the Great Lakes and taken down, because the Rush-Bagot Agreement said we couldn't. But weren't they governed by the Rush-Bagot Agreement still during the Wolesley campaign?
They very well could have been. It's beyond my level of competence on that, Fraser. I would. I'd have to do some more work on that part. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just something to look into.
Thank you. All right, I think just going to scan through the list here. I think that's it for the hands up. I don't see any more questions in the question and answer. So, Pat, I think we've done it.
Yes, I think so. Well, thank you, Ted, for a really interesting and well-researched presentation. And I'm sure we're all very happy that you're able to do it for us. And you brought a little-known segment, really, of Canadian history to light. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me tonight.
You're welcome. And
it was absolutely excellent, and a really unknown area. I worked up there one summer with the Dominion Forest Service all through that country, and that Kaministiquia River is quite a struggle to get through it. These guys are doing it through the bush to all intents and purposes. I mean, we call it a road, but that wasn't much of a road by the modern even country road comparison.
so anyway, since there's no more questions, thank you again. And as I say, at this time, I usually present you with a little gift of appreciation from RCMI, but due to these unprecedented times, I'm not able to do so. So keep an eye on your post box, and
I will.
will do it for me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pat.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.